The mind behind the weapon, the CZ-75 and the engineers who perfected ergonomic firearms. He held the pistol like a sculptor holds unfinished clay, studying the angle, the weight, the way cold steel pressed against the web of his thumb. František Koki stood alone in the Česká zbrojovka factory in Uherský Brod, the winter fog of 1975 rolling through the Moravian valleys outside. But inside this cramped engineering office, he saw only one thing: the prototype marked 01, 15 rounds. Steel frame, double-action trigger. It looked deceptively simple, but in his calloused hands it felt like something else entirely. It felt like vindication. 4 years. 4 years of rejections, confiscations, secret work after midnight, and the quiet terror that he might be wrong. That the angle he'd calculated, 109 degrees, not the conventional 120 of a Luger, not the aggressive 100 of a 1911, might be nothing more than obsession dressed as innovation. He raised the pistol, eyes closed, feeling the way it pointed naturally, instinctively, as if the weapon were an extension of bone and nerve, rather than an object held against the body's will. Outside, Czechoslovakia remained a conquered satellite. Soviet tanks had crushed the Prague Spring 7 years earlier. The STB monitored every blueprint, every conversation, every act of creativity that didn't serve Moscow's doctrine. Yet here in this small factory town, beneath the weight of occupation and institutional blindness, František Koki had built something that would outlive empires. He didn't know it yet. He only knew the weapon in his hand didn't lie. The story had begun 4 years earlier, in 1971, when the crisis wasn't bullets or battles, but something quieter and more insidious: obsolescence. By the early 70s, Czechoslovakia's firearms industry, once the jewel of Central European engineering, was withering under Soviet control. Export licenses were denied without explanation. Design innovation was crushed by committee. Meanwhile, Western militaries were adopting new sidearms: the Beretta 92, the SIG P220, high-capacity pistols built for modern combat doctrine. The Eastern Bloc had nothing to match them. The Makarov PM was reliable, but outdated. The Tokarev was heavy and brutal. František Koki understood the weight of that silence. Every rejected proposal, every design vetoed by men in Prague who had never held a weapon in combat. Every night spent calculating spring tensions and slide tolerances, knowing the final decision would be made in a Moscow office by someone who couldn't tell a slide stop from a sear. The crisis wasn't just tactical, it was existential. If Czech engineering couldn't prove its worth, the factories would be repurposed, the skilled workers would be scattered. An entire heritage of precision craftsmanship, stretching back to the Austro-Hungarian armories, would vanish into Soviet standardization. But Koki had learned something the committees in Prague hadn't. Doctrine is written by survivors, not planners. And the survivors, the border guards, the police officers, the special forces operators who wrote terse reports from the field, all said the same thing. They wanted a pistol that felt like an extension of their hand, something they could draw, aim, and fire without thinking, something that didn't punish them with recoil or failures, something human. He'd been 41 years old when he was promoted to lead designer at Česká zbrojovka in 1971. 3 children. A wife who feared his obsession with the perfect pistol would get him arrested. She wasn't wrong to worry. Innovation under communism was dangerous. Every deviation from Soviet orthodoxy was suspect. But Koki had made a private vow. If he only got one chance, it would be something they couldn't ignore. The tactical problem was deceptively simple. Modern combat demanded more rounds, faster reloads, better accuracy under stress. But the doctrinal problem was a wall of concrete. The Soviet army preferred revolvers or single-stack pistols. Reliability over capacity, they said. Simplicity over sophistication. The Czech Ministry of Defense parroted the same line. When Kautsky submitted his first proposal, 1 a high-capacity double-action pistol with a contoured grip. It was returned with a single word stamped in red: odmítnuto, rejected. He tried again. This time he didn't ask permission. He built a prototype himself, after hours, in secret. He machined it in the basement workshop, testing the grip angle on his own hands, on his colleagues' hands, on the hands of factory workers and off-duty police officers. And he discovered something remarkable: the natural pointing angle of the human wrist, when relaxed and extended as if pointing at a target, was 109 degrees. Not the steep angle of a Luger, not the flat angle of a 1911, exactly 109. When the grip matched that angle, the pistol aligned instinctively. No thought, no correction, pure extension. It was the difference between fighting a tool and trusting it. But the committees didn't care about angles. They cared about conformity. Now, in 1975, holding prototype 001, František Kocki allowed himself a moment of quiet certainty. The weapon in his hand was ready. The question was whether history was ready for it. If stories like this make you question what you do when everyone says you're wrong, but you know you're right, tell us in the comments, and stay with us for the next chapters. How long can you hold on to certainty when every institution around you insists you're chasing ghosts? Part 2. František Kocki had been born in 1930 in a country that would be renamed 4 times before he turned 40. His father was a machinist in a textile factory near the Morava River. His mother sewed uniforms for the Czechoslovak army. They lived in a small house where young František spent his childhood sketching machines in the margins of school books. Gears, levers, angles of force he couldn't yet calculate, but somehow understood in his bones. He had no formal university training, no engineering degree from Prague or Brno. But he had hands, and the rare kind of mind that could see forces invisible to others. Torque, friction, the microgeometry of metal meeting metal at speeds measured in milliseconds. His first job, at age 16 in 1946, was as an apprentice at the Zbrojovka Brno factory. He cleaned lathes. He filed burrs off rifle parts. He watched the old gunsmiths, men who had survived 2 world wars, and learned their silent language. One of them, a master named Antonín, told him something he never forgot. A weapon that hurts its user is a weapon that lies, Antonín had said one afternoon, adjusting the grip angle on a custom hunting rifle. The truth is in the angle, always the angle. František didn't fully understand it then, but he remembered the words. When the Soviets invaded in 1968, he understood perfectly. He'd watched Prague burn on state television. He'd seen young students facing down tanks with nothing but stones and rage. And he thought about Antonín's words, about truth, about the geometry of power, about the difference between a tool that dominates its user and one that trusts them. By 1971, František Kocki had been promoted to lead designer at Česká Zbrojovka's facility in Uherský Brod, in the green valleys of southern Moravia. The factory smelled of gun oil and metal shavings. The workshops hummed with the rhythm of lathes and milling machines. But the creative energy, the thing that had once made Czech firearms world-renowned, had been strangled by Soviet oversight. Every innovation required approval from Prague. Every approval required Moscow's blessing, and Moscow preferred conformity over excellence. Kocki's first proposal had been rejected within 3 weeks. He'd submitted detailed drawings for a high-capacity double-action pistol with an ergonomic grip. The response was a single stamped word: odmítnuto, rejected. No explanation, no feedback, just bureaucratic silence. His wife, Marie, had found him at the kitchen table that night, staring at the rejection letter. "They don't want it," she'd said softly. "They don't want anything that makes them think," he'd replied. "They want orders followed, problems ignored." "Then maybe you should follow orders." He'd looked up at her then, and she'd seen something in his eyes that frightened her. Not anger, not defiance. Something colder and more dangerous. Certainty. "If I follow orders," he'd said quietly, "then we're just building weapons that lie." So he'd built the prototype in secret, after hours, in the basement workshop, using scrap steel and borrowed tools, testing grip angles with a homemade jig he'd constructed from wood and piano wire. He measured hundreds of hands, factory workers, police officers, soldiers on leave, and recorded the natural pointing angle when they extended their arm as if aiming at a target. The data was undeniable. 109 degrees, again and again. The human wrist, when relaxed and natural, pointed at that exact angle. But data meant nothing to men who made decisions based on politics, not physics. The first prototype was crude, heavy. The trigger pull was inconsistent. The sear engagement needed refinement. But when František held it and pointed instinctively at a workshop target 10 meters away, the front sight aligned perfectly without conscious correction. The weapon pointed where his eye looked, as naturally as pointing a finger. He'd shown it to a colleague, Joseph, a machinist who'd worked with him for 15 years. "What do you think?" František had asked. Joseph had held the pistol, closed his eyes, extended his arm, opened his eyes again. The front sight had been centered on the target. "It feels wrong," Joseph had said slowly. "Wrong because it feels right. You understand?" "I understand. The committees will hate it. I know. The STB might confiscate it. Probably." Joseph had handed the pistol back carefully, as if it were something both precious and dangerous. "Then why are you doing this?" František Kauki had looked at the prototype in his hands, rough, unfinished, impossible to explain to anyone who cared more about doctrine than truth. "Because soldiers deserve weapons that don't fight them," he'd said quietly, "because the angle doesn't lie." 3 weeks later, during a surprise inspection by the STB, the prototype was confiscated. František was questioned for 3 hours in a windowless room in Uherský Brod. They wanted to know who authorized the project, who provided the materials, whether he was working with Western agents. He told them it was a design study, an academic exercise, nothing more. They didn't believe him, but they couldn't prove otherwise. When they finally released him, František walked back to the factory in the February cold, his hands shaking not from fear but from rage. They'd taken his work, his proof, his answer to a question no one in Prague wanted asked. But they'd made one mistake. They'd let him keep the drawings, and František Kauki knew something about Czech gunsmiths that the STB didn't. Once they'd built something true, they could build it again, better, faster, more refined. The prototype they'd confiscated was just the beginning. Part 3. The confiscated prototype sat in an evidence locker in Prague for 3 weeks. František Kauki returned to his regular work at Česká zbrojovka, designing minor modifications to existing production rifles, saying nothing about the pistol or the interrogation. But at night, in the small flat he shared with Marie and their 3 children, he redrew every dimension from memory. The grip angle, the trigger geometry, the slide tolerances, the feed ramp contour, everything. Marie found him one night at 3 in the morning, hunched over the kitchen table, pencil moving across graph paper with mechanical precision. "You're going to get yourself arrested," she whispered. "I'm already suspect," he replied without looking up. "The only way out is forward." Forward to what? Prison? Exile? He'd stopped drawing then, setting the pencil down carefully. "Forward to something that doesn't lie," he said. "Forward to proof they can't ignore." What František didn't know, couldn't know, was that the confiscated prototype hadn't been destroyed. A colonel in the Czech military police, a veteran of the Prague resistance named Karel Novotný, had seen it during routine evidence review. Curious, he'd taken it to a military firing range outside the city. He'd loaded 7 rounds of 9mm parabellum and fired at a target 15 meters away. His first group measured 4 centimeters. Tighter than anything he'd shot in 30 years of military service. He'd fired again. 3 centimeters. Colonel Novotný had stood there in the cold March wind, holding the crude prototype, and understood immediately what František Kutsky had been trying to build. Not a better weapon, a true weapon, one that trusted the shooter instead of fighting them. 2 days later, František received a plain envelope at the factory. Inside was a handwritten note on military stationery. "Your prototype has been returned to Zbrojovka Evidence Storage. Build more. I will handle the committees. KN." František had read the note 3 times, hands trembling. Then he'd burned it in the workshop furnace and gone to find Joseph. "We're starting again," he'd said, "tonight. The STB has other concerns. Someone higher up wants to see what we can build." Joseph had studied his friend's face, seeing something there he'd never seen before, not just certainty, but permission. "How many?" Joseph asked. 50, František said. 50 prototypes, each one slightly different. We test them all until we find the combination that sings. And so began Project Kovář, the blacksmith. 6 engineers working in parallel after official hours, machining parts in the basement workshops of Česká Zbrojovka. They tested spring weights, 16 different variations. Slide tolerances, measuring clearances to within 5/1000ths of a millimeter. Feed ramp angles, 37 iterations before they found the geometry that fed hollow points and ball ammunition with equal reliability. They worked through spring and summer of 1972, each prototype numbered and tested, the data recorded in notebooks František kept in a locked drawer. The breakthrough came in August. Prototype 037. František had modified the grip angle to exactly 109 degrees and lowered the bore axis by 4 millimeters. When he test-fired it, the muzzle flip was barely perceptible. The sight picture returned to target naturally, instinctively, as if the weapon itself wanted to be accurate. He'd handed it to Joseph without a word. Joseph fired 15 rounds in rapid succession. Every shot felt controlled, manageable, almost gentle. When he lowered the pistol, his hands weren't fatigued. His wrists weren't strained. The weapon had simply done what he'd asked it to do. "This is it," Joseph had said quietly. "This is the one." But František shook his head. "This is close. We can make it better." They refined prototype 037 through the fall of 1972, adding checkering to the grip, adjusting the trigger pull weight to exactly 4.5 kilograms double action, 2.2 kilograms single action, refining the slide serrations for better purchase in winter gloves. By December, they had built prototype 047, the version that would eventually become the CZ-75. Then news arrived from West Germany that changed everything. The German police were testing the SIG P220, a Swiss-designed high-capacity pistol with advanced ergonomics. It was everything the Eastern Bloc didn't have, and if West Germany adopted it as standard issue, the gap between NATO and Warsaw Pact sidearms would become embarrassingly obvious. The committees in Prague panicked. Suddenly, Project Kovář wasn't seditious. It was strategic. František was given 6 months to deliver a production-ready design. He delivered in 4. The final prototype, now officially designated Prototype 001, the original stolen number reclaimed, was tested by the Czech Special Forces in January 1975. They fired 10,000 rounds through it without a single malfunction. One operator, a veteran of Border Patrol named Marek, held the pistol after the test and said something František would remember for the rest of his life. "It feels like cheating," Marek had said, "like the weapon is doing half the work for me." "That's the point," František replied. "The weapon should serve you, not the other way around." The Ministry of Defense approved production on February 14, 1975. But there was a condition. Because Czechoslovakia was under Soviet trade restrictions, the design could not be patented internationally. This meant anyone could copy it, manufacture it, sell it, and František's team would receive no royalties, no recognition, no protection. František had sat in the procurement office, reading the approval document, feeling the weight of what he'd just won and what he'd just lost. Make it so good, the procurement officer had said flatly, that the copies won't matter. František Koutsky had nodded slowly. He'd spent 4 years fighting for permission to build something true. Now he had permission, but the truth would belong to everyone, and no one. Do you think you'd fight the system for what you believe works, or accept what doctrine says is impossible? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real innovation stories from history. What does vindication mean when the thing you created no longer belongs to you? Part 4. The first production CZ-75s rolled off the line in May 1975, in the same Uherski Brod factory where František Koutsky had built the secret prototypes. The machinery hummed with the rhythm of precision manufacturing, the sound of steel being shaped, tempered, fitted, tested. František walked the production floor every morning, watching workers assemble frames, install barrels, test trigger mechanisms. He checked tolerances with his own calipers. He test-fired random samples from each production batch. He refused to let a single pistol leave the factory that didn't meet the exact specifications of prototype 001. The weapon they'd built was deceptively simple in appearance. Forged steel frame, 15-round double-stacked magazine, double-action, single-action trigger, weight 1,000 grams loaded, length 206 millimeters, barrel length 120 millimeters, but the genius was in the geometry. The 109-degree grip angle, the low-bore axis that reduced muzzle flip, the contoured grip that fit naturally in the human hand, the slide that moved with mechanical precision, never binding, never hesitating. Joseph had asked him once, during the early production runs, what made the CZ-75 different from every other combat pistol. František had picked up one of the finished pistols, holding it thoughtfully. Most weapons are designed from doctrine, he'd said. Someone decides what a pistol should do, then engineers build to those specifications. But we did it backward. We asked what the human hand needs, what the human eye needs, what the human nervous system needs when survival depends on instinct rather than thought. Then we built to those needs. And if doctrine disagrees, František had smiled thinly. Doctrine never fires a weapon in combat. The first field reports came in July 1975. Czech border guards issued the CZ-75 reported faster qualification scores. Police officers in Prague found they could maintain accuracy during extended training sessions without hand fatigue. Special Forces operators wrote terse, professional assessments that all said the same thing: reliable, accurate, controllable. But the real test came in September. A Czech counter-terrorism unit was deployed to neutralize a hijacking situation at Ruzyně Airport in Prague. The team leader, an operator named Pavel, carried one of the early production CZ-75s. During the final breach, he engaged 3 armed hijackers in a confined space, the interior of a passenger aircraft. 7 shots fired, 7 hits, range varying from 3 to 12 meters. The hijackers were neutralized. No hostages were injured. In his after-action report, Pavel wrote, "The weapon performed flawlessly under extreme stress. Sight acquisition was instinctive. Recoil management required no conscious effort. I have carried pistols for 15 years, and this is the first one I trusted more than I doubted." František read the report in his office at Česká zbrojovka, hands shaking slightly. Not from fear, from vindication. But vindication brought its own burdens. By late 1975, word of the CZ-75 had spread beyond Czechoslovakia. Israeli intelligence services, always hungry for reliable weapons that weren't dependent on Western suppliers, had acquired samples through circuitous channels. They tested them extensively. The results were so impressive that Israeli counter-terrorism units began carrying modified copies, manufactured without permission, without patent protection, without acknowledgement of František's work. Then came the Italian manufacturers. Tanfoglio, based in Brescia, reverse-engineered the design and began producing clones for the European market. They called it the TA-90. It was nearly identical to the CZ-75, down to the grip angle and slide serrations. František saw photographs of the Italian copies in a trade magazine. He'd said nothing, just closed the magazine and returned to work. Marie found him that evening in the workshop, sitting in the dark, holding one of the original prototypes. "They're stealing it," she'd said softly. "Everything you built." "They're proving it," he'd replied. "Every copy is proof that the design works, that the angle was right, that the committees were wrong. But you get nothing." František had been silent for a long moment, turning the prototype in his hands, feeling the familiar weight, the perfect balance. "I get to know it's true," he'd said finally. "That's more than most engineers ever get." By 1977, the CZ-75 was being carried by law enforcement and military units in over 20 countries. Most were using unauthorized copies. The Swiss had their Sphinx. The Italians had their Tanfoglio. The Israelis had begun producing the Jericho 941, a direct clone with minor modifications. None paid royalties. None credited the Czech engineers. The Soviet trade restrictions had made František Koutski's masterwork into public domain, a gift to the world that he'd been forced to give. But the design kept proving itself. In Rio de Janeiro, police officers reported that the CZ-75 clones outperformed their aging revolvers. In Tel Aviv, counter-terrorism instructors noted that trainees qualified faster with the ergonomic grip angle. In Rome, firearms examiners conducted comparison tests and found that the CZ-75 pattern showed measurably less shot-to-shot deviation than competing designs. In 1979, a technical analysis appeared in a Swiss firearms journal. The author, a former military instructor, had tested 12 different combat pistols under identical conditions. His conclusion? The Czechoslovak CZ-75 represents a perfection of the double-action combat pistol. Its ergonomic design is so fundamentally sound that no subsequent manufacturer has meaningfully improved upon its basic geometry. This is the template all others now follow. František never saw that article. It was classified by the STB as strategically sensitive information and removed from Czech libraries. He continued working at Česká zbrojovka, designing modifications to existing rifles, overseeing quality control on the CZ-75 production line, teaching young engineers about tolerance stacks and material properties. He said little about the pistol that had made him, briefly, quietly, the most copied firearms designer in the world. At night, sometimes, he would hold prototype 001 and think about the 4 years between the first rejection and final approval. The confiscations, the interrogations, the secret workshops, the moment when Joseph had test-fired prototype 037 and understood what František had been chasing. He thought about Antonín, the old gunsmith who taught him that the truth was in the angle. And he thought about what truth cost when you found it before anyone else believed it existed. Part 5, November 1989. The Velvet Revolution swept through Czechoslovakia like a spring wind after a long winter. The communist government collapsed. Soviet troops began their withdrawal. The CIP was disbanded. And František Koutský, now 59 years old, watched on television as the world he'd navigated for 4 decades simply ended. He was still working at Česká zbrojovka, still overseeing the CZ-75 production line. But now the factory was preparing for something unprecedented: international export without Soviet restrictions, patent applications, trade agreements, the possibility finally of recognition and profit for the design that had been copied by 70 manufacturers worldwide. But the patent applications were rejected. Too late, the international patent offices said. The design had been in public production for 14 years. It was now considered prior art. The window for protection had closed in 1975, the moment the communist government had refused to file international patents. František's team, those who remained, Joseph had retired in 1985, received the news with quiet resignation. They'd known, really. They'd known since 1975 that the CZ-75 would belong to everyone and no one. That other manufacturers would grow wealthy from František's grip angle, his trigger geometry, his understanding of human anatomy translated into steel. But something else was happening that František hadn't anticipated. The CZ-75 was becoming legendary, not through marketing, not through military procurement campaigns, but through the quiet, insistent testimony of people who'd used it, operators who'd carried it in combat, officers who'd trained with it for decades, firearms instructors who'd seen 1,000 pistols pass through their hands and recognized the CZ-75 as something fundamentally different. In 1991, a Portuguese Special Forces operator wrote a letter to Česká zbrojovka. František read it in his office, the morning light streaming through windows that no longer had set-me watchers outside. "I have carried your pistol for 6 years. In that time, it has never failed me. But more than reliability, it has given me something I didn't know was possible: trust. When I draw this weapon, I know exactly where it will point. I know exactly how it will respond. It is not a tool I must master. It is an extension of what I already am. This is rarer than you know. Thank you." František folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer with dozens of others, letters from Brazil, from Israel, from Italy and Switzerland and South Africa, from soldiers and police officers and civilian instructors, all saying variations of the same thing: your weapon doesn't fight us. It trusts us. In 1993, the Cold War was definitively over. Czechoslovakia had peacefully split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and Česká zbrojovka began exporting the CZ-75 under its own name, finally, to open markets. Sales exploded, not because of advertising, but because 2 decades of field use had proven what František had calculated in secret workshops in 1972. The 109-degree angle was right. The copies continued. The Tanfolios, the Jerichos, the Baby Eagles, the Sphinx pistols. Dozens of manufacturers producing variations on František's template. But now, increasingly, buyers were asking for the original, the one made in Uherský Brod, the one that had started it all. František remained in his position at the factory until 1995, when he finally retired at age 65. On his last day, the factory workers gathered in the assembly hall. The plant manager gave a brief speech about František's contributions to Czech firearms engineering. There was polite applause. A small plaque, a handshake. František stood there, holding the plaque, and thought about the night in 1972 when he'd first achieved the 109-degree angle on prototype 037. The moment when the weapon had pointed naturally, instinctively, as if it had always been waiting for someone to ask the right question. He'd gone home to his small apartment in Uherský Brod, the plaque wrapped in paper, and Marie had asked him if he was proud. "Pride is for monuments," he'd replied quietly. "I just wanted to build something true." In 1997, something unexpected happened. A former CIA firearms instructor named James Cirillo published a memoir about his career training federal agents and special operations personnel. In one chapter, he described a 1983 comparison test he'd conducted at Quantico, evaluating every major combat pistol in service with Western militaries and law enforcement agencies. He'd test-fired them all: the Beretta 92, the SIG P226, the Glock 17, the Colt 1911, and one pistol that wasn't officially in the test protocol, a CZ-75 that an Israeli instructor had brought as a personal sidearm. Cirillo wrote, "The CZ-75 was a revelation. It was the only pistol in the test that felt like it had been designed by someone who understood hands instead of regulations. The grip angle was so natural that sight acquisition happened before you consciously aimed. The trigger broke cleanly without disturbing the sight picture. The recoil impulse was straight back, not up. After firing 200 rounds, my hands weren't fatigued. This should have been the NATO standard. Instead, it was made in a communist country nobody trusted and copied by everyone who actually fired it. The memoir became a bestseller in firearms circles. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know about the mysterious Czech pistol that had perfected ergonomics decades before Western manufacturers caught up. In 1998, František Kautsky received a letter from the President of the Czech Republic. It was formal, brief, and decades late. It thanked him for engineering that brought honor to our nation and recognized his pioneering work in ergonomic firearm design. František read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer beneath the faded blueprints of Prototype 01. He never framed it, never hung it on a wall. Because for František, the real recognition hadn't come from governments or presidents. It had come from the Portuguese operator who'd written that the weapon trusted him, from Pavel, who'd neutralized 3 hijackers in an aircraft and reported that the CZ-75 felt like cheating, from Marek, the border guard who'd said it did half the work for him, from every soldier and officer and instructor who'd fired František's pistol and understood, without needing to be told, that someone had finally asked what the human hand needed instead of what doctrine demanded. That was vindication. The rest was just paperwork. Part 6. František Kautsky died on October 12, 2011, in a small flat in Brno. He was 81 years old. His obituary in the Czech press was brief, noting his 4-decade career at Česká zbrojovka, his role in developing the CZ-75, and the fact that the pistol had been produced in over 1 million units across dozens of countries. It mentioned his wife, Marie, who had passed away 3 years earlier, his 3 children, his 6 grandchildren. It did not mention the rejected proposals, the confiscated prototypes, the 3-hour interrogation by the STB, the 4 years of secret work after midnight. The burden of watching 70 manufacturers grow wealthy from a design he'd been forbidden to patent. The letters from operators saying his weapon had saved their lives. The night he'd discovered that the natural pointing angle of the human wrist was exactly 109 degrees, and the world had pretended not to care until the numbers made caring unavoidable. His funeral was attended by family, former colleagues, and a handful of retired firearms engineers who'd worked alongside him in the dark years before the Velvet Revolution. They told stories about František's obsessive precision, his refusal to compromise on tolerances, his habit of test-firing random samples from every production batch even when quality control said it wasn't necessary. One of them, Pavel Novak, who'd been an apprentice under František in the 1980s, said something at the gathering afterward that made several people nod in recognition. He wasn't trying to build the perfect weapon, Pavel said quietly. He was trying to build an honest one. There's a difference. By 2011, the CZ-75 pattern had become the most copied pistol design in modern history. Over 70 manufacturers produced variants. Some were licensed, most weren't. The Israeli Defense Forces carried Jericho 941s, Brazilian police carried Tanfolios, Swiss counter-terrorism units carried Sphinx pistols, Turkish military forces carried Canik clones, and in over 50 countries, armed professionals carried the original CZ-75, made in the same Uherský Brod factory where František had built Prototype 01 in 1975. The design had changed warfare in a way that wasn't measured in battles won or enemies defeated. It had changed the fundamental relationship between shooter and weapon. Before the CZ-75, combat pistols were tools you mastered through repetition and discipline. After the CZ-75, they became extensions of natural human pointing instinct. The difference was subtle, but in the moment when survival depended on instinct rather than thought, subtle differences became everything. Firearms historians later traced the shift. Before 1975, pistol grip angles varied wildly from 100 to 125 degrees. After 1985, new designs consistently clustered around 107 to 110 degrees. The industry had quietly, without acknowledgement, accepted that František Kuki had been right. The natural angle of the human wrist wasn't negotiable. Doctrine could insist otherwise. But hands didn't lie. In 2015, 4 years after František's death, the CZ-75 was inducted into the Deutsches Waffenjournal's Hall of Fame for combat pistols that had fundamentally influenced firearms design. The citation noted that the CZ-75 established ergonomic principles that remain the standard by which all combat pistols are judged. František's eldest son, Tomáš, attended the ceremony in Germany. He accepted the recognition on his father's behalf. During the reception, a Swiss firearms engineer approached him. "I never met your father," the engineer said, "but I've studied his work for 30 years. He solved a problem most designers didn't know existed." "What problem?" Tomáš asked. He asked what the human body needed before asking what doctrine wanted. That's revolutionary and dangerous. Tomáš thought about that, about his father working in basement workshops after midnight, about the years when František would come home silent and exhausted, smelling of gun oil and metal shavings, about the way his mother had worried that obsession would destroy him. "Was it worth it?" Tomáš asked the Swiss engineer. "Everything he sacrificed?" The engineer considered the question carefully. "Your father built something that will outlive nations," he said finally. "The CZ-75 will be in service when the governments that tried to suppress it are forgotten, when the committees that rejected his proposals are dust, when the manufacturers who copied his design without credit have moved on to other products. The weapon remains, the angle remains, the truth he found remains." He paused, then added quietly, "Whether that's worth a life, only your father could say." In the archives at Česká Zbrojovka, preserved in climate-controlled storage, sits prototype 001. The pistol František Kuki test-fired in 1975, feeling vindication in the way cold steel pressed against the web of his thumb. The serial number is still visible, 001. The grip shows wear from František's hands. The slide bears microscopic tool marks from the original machining. Museum curators sometimes ask if it can be displayed. The factory always declines. Some things, they say, are too important to be merely historical. In 2020, during a global pandemic that emptied cities and closed borders, firearms sales surged worldwide. New shooters, people who'd never held a weapon, walked into gun stores asking for recommendations. And instructors, again and again, handed them pistols built to František Kuki's template, the CZ-75 or its countless descendants, and watched as the grip angle caused natural, instinctive pointing. The students would ask, "Why does this one feel different?" And the instructors would answer if they knew the history, "Because someone asked what your hand needed before anyone else thought to ask." That's František Kuki's legacy, not in patents or profits, not in government recognition or historical plaques, but in the millions of people who've held a weapon built to his specifications and felt without words that something fundamental was right, that the tool served them instead of dominating them, that the angle didn't lie. In his final years, when friends and former colleagues would visit František in his small apartment in Brno, they'd sometimes ask if he had regrets about the stolen patents, the unauthorized copies, the decades of obscurity while others grew wealthy from his innovations. He always gave the same answer. "I built something true," he'd say. "That's more than most people get." And when they pressed him, wasn't he angry? Didn't he want recognition? Didn't he deserve compensation? He'd shake his head slowly. "Pride is for monuments," he'd reply. "I just wanted to build something that didn't lie." That was František Kuki's revolution, not in violence, not in conquest, but in the quiet insistence that doctrine must bow to biology, that institutions must yield to truth, and that the hardest battles are fought not against enemies, but against the comfortable certainty of people who've never questioned what everyone knows. The CZ-75 remains in production today, still made in Uherski Brod, still using František's 109-degree grip angle, still proving every day that someone who asked the right question in a basement workshop in 1972 understood something that no committee, no doctrine, and no ideology could deny. The human hand has its own geometry and tools built to honor. That geometry will always outlast tools built to honor power. In the end, it wasn't the weapon that endured. It was the mind that dared to ask what truth felt like in the human hand. Undine, if this story reminded you that changing the world often means being right before anyone believes you, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What would you create if you knew you'd never be credited for it, but knew it would outlive you anyway?